My name is Elizabeth Guidry. Welcome to the ThinkJSOU series presented by the Office of Strategic Engagement at the Joint Special Operations University. We're happy to welcome our distinguished speaker today. This video is unclassed and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions of the speakers are their own and may not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, and policies of the United States government, the United States Department of Defense, the United States Special Operations Command, or the Joint Special Operations University. If you have any questions after the video, please contact us at thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Welcome to today's ThinkJSOU event with Anna Puglisi, Senior Fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Anna is an accomplished former National Counterintelligence Officer for East Asia that has testified before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence concerning the foreign intelligence entity threats to the U.S. She has co-authored a few books and contributed to a number of national security and academic forums. The agenda for today's talk is to discuss key threats to U.S. research development acquisition, or RDA, activities and investments, and the impact of U.S. SOF efforts in this arena. Ms. Puglisi will begin with a strategic overview to help frame the current threats posed by the FIE to U.S. and DOD RDA activities and investments. The majority of today's discussion will center on the People's Republic of China and how their activities are degrading U.S. strategic and competitive advantages in this space, how the PRC is collecting, stealing, and exploiting U.S. technologies and proprietary information, what the U.S. Counterintelligence Enterprise can do to detect, identify, exploit, and/or neutralize the threat, and lastly, its impacts on U.S. SOF RDA. Anna, welcome to this ThinkJSOU. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to participate in this interview. Thank you. The floor is yours for opening comments.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here because I believe that this is one of the most the biggest challenges that we'll face, really, I think, in our lifetime. And so to give just a quick overview, I think what is so challenging about where we find ourselves with the People's Republic of China is that, our system is really set up for a very different challenge. When we think about all of our counterintelligence system, our economic things such as export controls, CFIUS, it's really set up to fight a very clear challenge, which was the Soviet Union's. And it really, I think, encompassed three main parts: things that involved an intelligence officer, things that were clearly a military technology, and things in a very narrow sense that were illegal. And what is so challenging about how China targets our technologies is that it really comes at the seams between counterintelligence, law enforcement, and intelligence, and in foreign intelligence, knowing where those seams are. And China also uses what we call non-traditional collectors. And so these are the experts that are involved in these programs that are targeting the technologies. And it goes way beyond the traditional national security sense. So instead of only military technologies, we're increasingly seeing the technologies that are being targeted are AI, biotechnology, new materials, pollution control technology, and things that are really way beyond the scope of what we would normally have looked at. You can in some ways say that, what China is doing really undermines the global norms of science, because, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the program, but what is so challenging is that as they become more capable, they target earlier and earlier in the development cycle. So these are those new and emerging technologies where there is no clear leader. And that, I think, is what makes it so challenging, both to the RDA process, as well as trying to gain that strategic technical advantage, especially in the SOF world.
Thank you. You mentioned a number of points. I want to highlight one of those, which is the non-traditional collectors. On the screen, viewers can see what the FBI categorizes as some indicators associated with the non-traditional collector threat. A non-traditional collector, or NTC, will develop one or more of these indicators according to the FBI's case example on non-traditional collectors found at the FBI.gov website. An example of the NTC threat was highlighted in a 2018 FBI report titled China, the Risk to Academia. In the report, the FBI explains, as of March 2018, more than 1.4 million international students and professors were participating in America's open and collaborative academic environment that entails both substantial benefit and notable risk. The vast majority of these scholars pose no threat. However, some foreign actors, particularly foreign state adversaries, seek to elicit or illegitimately acquire U.S. academic research and information to advance their scientific, economic, and military development goals. This saves them time, money, and resources required to build these RDA programs. As we'll discuss later on, the PRC poses the greatest threat and challenge in this arena. In the book you helped co-author, published by Routledge, titled Chinese Industrial Espionage, you highlight some of the issues with modern and historical assessments of the PRC's espionage activities. Specifically, you mentioned the lack of academic writings about the non-traditional collection methods, practices, or behaviors, and how the PRC employs a whole of society approach to acquire and exploit next-gen technologies and gather information through various human, technical, and cyber-related activities. Do you have any recommendations or resources CI and law enforcement professionals can leverage to detect or identify non-traditional collector threats earlier? Additionally, do you have any recommendations on how to better inform academia and commercial technology industry partners to more effectively protect their proprietary information?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ike. That actually, that is a big challenging question. So I'm going to take it in a couple of parts. But the first thing I want to say is, while we, are concerned with the policies and programs that China's government has regarding its diaspora, I think it's really important to note and that we are a country of immigrants, and we really this is not to and I've said it in my previous testimonies that extremes, either shutting the door or not having any questions about who is participating in some of these programs are really counterproductive. And there's really no place for any kind of xenophobic rhetoric or extreme policies. But it's because of those principles, and I think that really comes down to the values of open democratic societies, the US, our allies, and like-mindeds, that it's important to talk about these programs, because China really is engaged in a strategic rivalry with the US, and it's centered on economic power. It has an all-of-government strategy to target that technology, and that is really what makes it so challenging, because it's focused on that technology, and it's focused on the people who develop that technology, and so that technological know-how. And again, you make that right point. We are not saying that every student that comes here is part of any of these programs, but I think what it's really important, and we can talk a little bit about this later in the program, but that it's the way Beijing views its diaspora and the policies and programs that it's put in place, dating back to the early 1990s, some of them, that create these challenges, and it creates the challenges of how they view their students and their faculty that are overseas. And that's why it's so important as well to highlight the new national security law, as well as some of the other laws that China has put in place that actually compel its citizens and its businesses to work with the Chinese government. I don't have to tell you the power of a billionaire when we look at what happened with Jack Ma, but the challenge that creates, if China can silence its billionaires, what it can definitely challenge, and it can definitely silence its students and its faculty members.
I agree. The breadth and scope of PRC control over its citizens is alarming. We saw how the PRC responded during the COVID-19 pandemic, leveraging surveillance technology and authoritarian regime practices to restrict travel and confine citizens in horrendous living conditions. Now, with advancements in AI and quantum computing, the PRC is exporting its surveillance practices across the globe, evident by the recent indictments of 40 Chinese national police officers by the Justice Department in New York for transnational repression schemes targeting U.S. citizens. This is just one of the many examples the Xi regime has exhibited during his reign. Xi Jinping continues to exploit technology to maintain his power and control in China, and his attempts to gain control on the world stage through the One Belt and One Road initiative, debt trap diplomacy, and espionage activities in both the physical and virtual domains. For example, the use of the Thousand Talents program, the use of businesses, scholars, students, and tourists to gather information of intelligence value, and as you mentioned, targeting those experts within industry to steal proprietary information and sell and provide those secrets to the Chinese intelligence. It's astonishing. In the cyber domain, PRC attacks government, commercial, and private networks to breach and extract countless amounts of sensitive data on a routine basis, which brings me to our first question. Can you provide a strategic overview to help frame the current threats posed by the foreign intelligence entities, the U.S. and DOD research, development, acquisition activities, and investments?
Sure. I think it's important to start with the drivers. So China really does view technology as a national asset, and it sees it as and that robust S&T infrastructure that supports it as key to dominating and growing its economy into the next century. And so the way it has structured its system to reach these goals are inherently at odds with key assumptions of globalization, such as open markets, reciprocity, transparency, and that the findings will be shared equally and unencumbered. And China's leaders don't make any effort to hide their views in this regard about the importance of technology and commercial dominance, and how they view a robust S&T infrastructure as really key to building its advanced economy, not necessarily a market economy. And I think that that's where some of the challenges lie, is the assumptions that entities go into their relationships, either with collaborators, with business partners. And here's some things, these are not my words, these are Xi's words, about commanding the heights of technological innovation. And in regards to artificial intelligence, talking about it as a vital driving force for a new round of technological revolution and industrial transformation, and that China must control artificial intelligence and ensure it's secretly kept in its own hands. And so it really doesn't talk a lot about the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about collaborations. And I think it really comes down to the idea that our systems really aren't the same. And I know there was a lot of hope when China started to open up to the West that as it became richer, it would acquiesce to the global norms of not only science, but of commerce and relationships. And we've seen, especially over the last decade, with Xi taking power, that just isn't really the case. And so that, again, creates that friction in the relationship, but also the challenge in how we go about protecting our innovation base, since we are a laws-based, rules-based system up against a very, very different system that doesn't adhere to the same rules as we do.
Anna, that was a great overview. Reminds me of Senator Wicker's comments during the 2023 U.S. SOCOM and U.S. Cybercom posture statement testimonies. Senator Wicker explained the U.S. faces the most complex and daunting set of security challenges since the height of the Cold War. From the Chinese Communist Party's unprecedented military buildup, growing from hegemonic ambitions, to Russia's brazen and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, our adversaries are testing American resolve. The CCP's use of all elements of national power have enabled it to gain firm footholds in every theater. Through predatory lending practices and economic investments, to technological theft and natural resource extraction activities on the African and South American continents, has postured China in a position to challenge and or replace existing global norms with something more in line and conducive to Xi's vision. While China is the nation's pacing challenge, can you elaborate on the threat from other FIE or FIE actors such as Russia and Iran, specifically their activities in the virtual domain and where we invest our resources from a CI perspective?
So I think what sets China apart in this regard is the scale and the scope. And then that's not to say that the challenge that we face, especially from cyber actors throughout the world, are not something that we should pay attention to. But Beijing's policies really are dynamic and tailored to the changing landscape of technological development. And this all comes from their medium long-term plan for S&T development, Made in China 2025, policies for their strategic emerging industries. And I think one that what many of us have been really focused on, and you've seen it in the news and our elected officials are talking about, is the whole idea for military civil fusion or military civil integration, which is a policy that they have adhered to for decades. I think it's important to do is it highlights how holistic the system is. It really blurs the lines between public and private, between military and civilian. And it really is focused on developing technologies and then applying them wherever they can be used. So sometimes that's civilian to military, but sometimes it's actually military to civilian. And a great example of that is batteries, and the batteries that are used in electric vehicles. Because in a lot of times, the defense industries have some of the best practices for that. But I think what's really striking about this, the 13th five-year plan for military civil fusion, which was established in 2017, is that it's focused on those emerging technologies. And we talk a little bit about, it's the RDA process. It is those early stage ideas and things that are not traditionally seen as national security issues. So quantum telecommunications and computing, neuroscience, brain-inspired research. And that policy actually states that such projects will be supported by foreign outreach initiatives. And one of the things, some of my more recent work, I've looked at what they call, we call it our S&T wish list, but it's looking at what is the bureaucracy that in the Chinese government that supports these kinds of endeavors, because it is a really different model than what we've seen in the past. And again, highlighting that the role of the state that permeates the researchers and the business community is really what creates this and makes this really different. So some of the work that we've done that focused on S&T diplomats basically is it's a very interesting bureaucracy, and that entities in China can actually find a gap in what they're looking for, either a technology or technological know-how, fill out a form, send it into the local government, central government. It goes out to the embassies, to the S&T diplomats, and then they play matchmaker looking to fill those strategic gaps. And the two things that are the main focus of the snapshot that we looked at were AI and biotechnology that were being targeted. So very, very different than in the past, where it was a clearly, military systems or things that directly related to military. And then we touched a little bit about the talent programs. These also are not new. I think we've heard the most about the 1,000 talents that has of course also been in the news and then disappeared, because we see that happening a lot with whenever there's a light shown on some of these policies. But I think what it really highlights is that the CCP and the Chinese government really do take a very different approach, or the way they view a Western education and universities. They really view that as the entry point into the US innovation system. And, I will pause it to say, because it's an easier target. Xi himself has called human capital and human talent as the first resource. And a lot of policies in China reflect that, because there are hundreds of these talent programs, not just the 1,000 talent.
Agreed. I like that you mentioned some of the emerging technologies such as AI and advancements in biotech industry. These technologies span a wide array of industries to include the medical industry, pharmaceuticals, health information, DNA, biometrics, and bioengineering and biohuman enhancements. And then lastly, the cognitive domain. The CCP's extensive cyber attack and exploitation capabilities, all of them to target, exploit, and corner the market, similar to how they did in the commercial drone industry. The CCP has made it clear they want to be the world's leading producer and provider in the biohealth industry, from cheap medicine, gene editing services, and low-cost healthcare to biotech and human interfaces and enhancements. The issue for the U.S. and the military is the majority, if not all of these efforts, are accomplished in the private or commercial sectors, which falls outside the Defense Department, which is in the interagency or local law enforcement's arena, which lack the resources to handle a threat of this magnitude. This creates huge gaps and seems the PRC currently exploit and will continue to take advantage if left unprotected. Can you talk to how China is using all of its elements of national power to exploit these gaps and seams to commit these crimes?
Yes, I think biotech is a really important field to talk about, given all of the, because it's that industries of the future, right? There are things that we can think about, but are not quite here yet. And I think that that's really kind of what makes this so important. So China has said that it wants to move from being a biotech power to a biotech superpower. And so what does that mean? It has put in place programs and policies and investments over time to slowly move up that value chain. And you can in some ways talk about it as the race. There is currently this race from genotype to phenotype. So basically trying to figure out what genes do. What keeps me awake at night is not so much what we can do today with all of that genomic material. It's what will be possible in the future. And once that genomic data is gone, it's gone. And it's in some ways, it's much more insidious than even the cyber intrusions into companies. It's that we have not come up with policies to protect our genomic data. So while China has restricted the export of its own genomic data, while we basically give it away. And so a lot of people enter into the hospital or go to have a test and don't realize that the tissue sample or blood sample or the genomic data that they are giving to have this test actually doesn't always stay in the US. And that is something, and we bring this up in the interagency of, thinking ahead of how do we deal with this. But I think some of the points that you make about, these are going to be remarkable technologies, and we want to find ways that we can harness them for the greater good, but at the same time, protect against their misuse. And that includes, we think about it as precision medicine and the kinds of strides that we can make to cure diseases or to help people that are suffering from genetic diseases, but it's much broader than that. It's harnessing biology to make things. It's agriculture. It's a whole different way of how do we deal with a changing climate, so we can have plants and animals that can live at more extreme temperatures. And what we see China putting in place over time is really touching on all facets of those of those areas, and the genomic data is going to be key to that. And then one other thing, just to comment on, it does give them a strategic advantage if they have access to their own data as well as the world's data, and that both for good uses and also for the potential misuse of that data.
Thank you. That was very insightful. The agricultural industry and what China's doing with low-cost drones, leveraging AI and big data analytics to create applications for farmers to track various data sets is extremely concerning for a myriad of reasons. These drones and their applications can gather telemetry data, identify a harvest's yield, soil composition, watering, and pesticide consumption and use. It keeps me up at night. I say that because for all the benefits these technologies bring the farming industry, there's also the risk that state or non-state actors may exploit these technologies to exert control or cause harm of global proportions, not just physically by destroying crops, but also virtually by stealing the data. We also have to look at it economically and across the food industry and what it can cause from a influence or control issue.
I think the ag piece is one of those areas that is really overlooked. But I think it has the characteristics of what we're seeing in other areas, whether it be genomic sequencing. You mentioned the drones, and it's where we see China having a strategy and using its national champions, whether it be BGI or DJI or the drone maker, which build themselves as private companies, yet still have ties to the strategic plans of the Chinese government. And we are so focused on lowest cost, whether it be in hospitals in our healthcare system, or you mentioned the agricultural data that is immensely important to, both from a strategic perspective of just knowing where everything is, but also the implications of, if there's drought or exactly how these fields are running. But I think, moving forward, this is one of those areas, and we talk a lot about, okay, how do you get in front of this? Is really, in some of these strategic areas, having to focus on, okay, what is the best value for the nation as opposed to the lowest cost? Because we actually pay for it in the long run. And so to be able to find and think through, the implications of allowing a competitor at best have access to these key strategic areas.
It's mind-boggling that we allow the CCP and these Chinese companies, which are just an extension of the CCP, to buy our farmland and exploit our laws and processes against us in order to get preferred customer ratings on the agricultural side. Set companies to collect and gather our DNA sequencing data while we as a populace give it away for pennies on the dollar. Companies that prey on consumers that want to know about their ancestry, it's sickening. If you look beyond the initial layers, you'll discover these companies have ties directly to the CCP or a subsidiary that ties to the CCP. We see that heavily on the RDA side of the house as well. So when we look at RDA companies, we'll see very similar practices. So as we move on to the next question, how does the PRC pose such a threat to the US and our ability to retain our competitive advantages? Can you address what the USG Counterintelligence Enterprise can do to confront this threat, since the preponderance of these activities reside outside the DOD, where the majority of our CI capability exists?
It's a really complex problem, and I feel like we can't arrest our way out of this, and it really kind of comes down to a couple of areas. And first is that the promote piece is just as important as the protect. And so what does that mean? Is thinking about these new areas and these industries strategically, and looking to bring in underrepresented groups to the STEM pipeline, because we have a pretty leaky STEM pipeline right now. You often hear, well, we don't have enough American students in our laboratories, but it's not just the PhDs. It's how do we think about what is that technically proficient workforce going into the future that is going to work in biomanufacturing, that's going to work in some of these industries that we don't even have a name for yet. And yet that's going to take a level of, not the PhD level, but a level of technical proficiency, onshoring some of these areas, and really thinking again the technology strategically. That when we have a competitor and that has companies that do not have to make market-based decisions, that has market access to our own companies, restricts market access to our own companies, we need to call that out. We need to have those tough conversations about transparency, reciprocity, a fair and level playing field, and have to give China a lot of credit when we look at what they've done over the last 2 decades of strategic investments over time, investments in human capital, investments in what we call big science facilities, and thinking through in these really key areas, what are those investments that we need to do today that will impact and drive discovery 5, 10, 15 years from now? And so beginning to, and that sounds a little bit like industrial policy, CHIPS and Science Act is a good start, but we've done this before. When you think about it, I mean, we've had the Manhattan program, we had the space program. We thought about technology in those ways. And so it's I think kind of rethinking how we approach these areas where the timelines are longer, right? These are areas where it's investment over longer timelines than a lot of companies can live with, and or a lower ROI, but have that strategic impact going forward.
You mentioned a few things that stand out. You said a fair and level playing field is our desired end state. But what incentive does the CCP have when they know what and how they've been acting has produced significant returns? I sit there and reflect on the desire to have a fair and level playing field. That's great. If you have people of like mind and values, that's feasible. When you have a government system that is contrary to the current global norms, we see what's happening with the multipolar shift, where we have some of our historical partners and allies in South America, Asia, and Europe shifting to partner with the Chinese because they view them as a more viable solution or want to position themselves on the perceived winning side of this competition. It's really frustrating and mind-boggling.
Yeah, you raise a good point. Actually, I've written about this, the myth of the stateless global society, right? And the idea that, and that there is a lot of good that have come out of globalization, but there is a lot of challenges. And you're right, there has been no cost. China has not had, there hasn't been a cost to them for breaking the rules and playing by, or I would say, not even breaking them, playing by a different set of rules. And that's why it's so important to tell these stories. And it's important to highlight, the human rights abuses, because really at the end of the day, that's really, I think, one of the biggest concerns is, do we want these new technologies, AI, biotech, reflecting our values, or do we want them reflecting the values of a system that is really contrary to freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of movement, lack of surveillance, all those kinds of issues. And we talk a lot about them and as ethical asymmetries. And how do you want to see these technologies applied? And that goes not only to the extensive surveillance and camera systems, the social credit score, but thinking the unthinkable of what does that mean when you then layer that genomic data on top of this already extensive surveillance system. And that's kind of scary. And that's really what's at stake, those values. And so we really need to talk about that. And again, we really need I believe we really need to, again, CHIPS and Science is a great start, but, working together to build, that infrastructure and, creating those bridges to get technology out of the lab, supporting our companies in those areas, or whether it be public-private or different things that we've done in the past, so that we can support those things that have longer timelines, need investment, and have lower ROIs, because that's where we see China stepping in.
I agree. We see the news articles where the CCP have used predatory lending practices via the One Belt and One Road initiative to cause countries in West Asia that partnered with the CCP for low-cost infrastructure investments and initiatives. Now the CCP is calling all their debt in, causing economic hardships on these poor countries, forcing them to the brink of collapse. The CCP is unwilling to help these countries. Through economic coercion and intimidation, the CCP, in essence, is blackmailing these countries to pay or flop. If they fail to pay, then the CCP will use it as an opportunity to further exert influence and control by placing a willing and loyal figurehead in charge that answers to the party line. You mentioned we haven't held the CCP accountable over the past few decades. As we look back through publicly available data, we see that the CCP has leveraged an extensive array of espionage threats against the U.S., which brings me to the next question. How is China collecting, exploiting, and stealing U.S. technologies and information?
So China actually has a multifaceted effort to target our technologies. And increasingly, it's earlier in the development cycle. So in some cases, they're still looking for systems or actual technology chips, fill in the blank. But increasingly, it's data and it's that technical know-how. It's that secret sauce, right? Because that's, it's one thing you can, to have that experience. How do you set up a company? How do you do these experiments? How do you actually use some of these big science facilities? So we can't underplay that. But it is a mix, as you mentioned, as we look across some of these cases, but also in the way China talks about it. It's leveraging collaborations. It's the using joint ventures, using market access to extract technology concessions from businesses that want to do business in the China market. It's traditional things such as the cyber espionage and cyber intrusions into our companies. And it's that kind of slow bleed of either in companies or, increasingly either M&A or actually, buying companies, buying whole things and factories and moving them to China. And it's basically recruiting talent, having folks that have worked on these projects or worked in these companies go back to China, or unfortunately they have a policy called serve in place, so which means you can still serve the Chinese Communist Party if you regardless of where you are, and they really do tap into their diaspora in that way. And I would say that especially if folks have family that are still in the PRC, it really creates a challenge because of the lengths that this government is willing to go to meet its strategic goals. And I think by not telling these stories and not talking about that, we really do, the Chinese people a disservice, because we don't talk about the kind of pressures that can be brought to bear on the individuals that work in these companies or students. But yeah, it's definitely a multifaceted effort. And again, just to highlight, we see them targeting it early in the development cycle. And that's really challenging too, because our rules, regulations, laws are not set up to look at, basic research or applied research or how this is going on, because that's really been the open part, and it should stay that way. I mean, that is the essence of science. But I tell my colleagues and the academics that I work with that there's a difference though between sharing and sharing when you feel like it and stealing, right? So, people say, oh, well, this is open research, we're going to publish it anyway, but you publish it when you choose to, and you share it with whom you want to, or you should be able to. And the really valuable part, the time and resource intensive part sometimes, is what doesn't work, right? So if someone has all of your data, understands what does and does not work, and your ideas, and then uses that along with their own and doesn't share, that's not collaboration. And so that's when we come back to, okay, where is that reciprocity? Where is the transparency? And that is another issue that makes it very challenging, is hiding affiliations, either with the government or with military related entities that are working on some of China's weapon systems, and thinking through, okay, do we want to train the next generation of scientists that are going to build Chinese weapons?
That last piece about hiding affiliations is spot on. A recent case in the U.S. Army where a service member that joined via the Military Accessions Vital to National Interest, or MAVNI program, was brought on due to his Chinese ethnicity and linguistic capabilities. He was to serve as a linguist, however, failed to divulge that his family members were still active members of the CCP. The plan was for that service member to serve out his enlistment providing intelligence to the MSS. And once U.S. citizenship was obtained, then segue into another government entity like the CIA, NSA, or NASA. That service member was sentenced to 8 years in prison for acting as an unregistered agent of the PRC. We know that the Chinese community is a very tight-knit group, which makes it difficult for CI and law enforcement organizations to identify who is working as non-traditional collectors or who are actually here and want to be contributing members of American society. As we discussed earlier, the CCP and Xi's control over Chinese citizens is a cause for concern. We've seen the CCP's reach and level of control on our own streets here in the US with the illegal police stations in New York and California. The FBI has identified these threats and are plagued with a new Chinese-focused espionage investigation on average every 12 hours. In 2018, the FBI published that report titled China, the Risk to Academia, which recognized the vast majority of students and researchers from China are in the US for legitimate academic reasons and contribute to the diversity of backgrounds and ideas important to our free society. However, the Chinese government uses some of these Chinese students, mostly postgraduate students and postdoctorate researchers studying science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, and professors to operate as non-traditional collectors of intellectual property. In 2018, China cost the US economy between $225 and $600 billion in counterfeit goods, pirated software, and theft of trade secrets. Taking all this into consideration, does our CI enterprise need to be overhauled and brought out of the stovepipes of the various agencies and departments to create a new structure, or do we need to operate as we're currently configured while trying to reduce or remove the seams that are currently exploited by the FIE?
That's a great question. So I am on the record that I feel like we don't have the system we need to counter this challenge, because it's a very different challenge. You know, our system was set up to fight the Soviets. So clear military end use, usually an intelligence officer, and fit into the very narrow definitions if it was of illegal. And this stuff is just more complicated, right? Because it's a former supervisor or boss of mine said that academia and commerce is the new geopolitical battle space. And that's why this is such a challenge, because these areas and these populations that are not used to thinking in this way. And we wish they didn't have to think in this way, because this really kind of goes against the whole, ethos of collaboration and academic science. But unfortunately, we have a competitor that views this as a okay avenue to fill its strategic gaps. And so, there's some really low-hanging fruit of cyber hygiene, protecting your networks, asking some basic questions about what your background is, and and they're deciding in those areas where are we willing to accept risk, or there is no risk, and in those areas that we're not. And I think it's really in discussing this, it's also important to, as you mentioned, the differences between undergraduates or students studying something other than STEM, because those are very, very different constituencies, and risk versus low risk, no risk. And so really kind of thinking through what is the system that we need to have this kind of information. How do we assist the private sector and academia in understanding who they're dealing with? Because basically you have our individual companies and our individual faculty members up against the nation state, and that's not a fair fight. So I think it really will take a stepping back, and and we all have to work together in this. We can't, as I mentioned before, we can't arrest our way out of this. So it's telling these stories. It's highlighting some of both the policies and programs of the Chinese government, but also the treatment of their own citizens, and the targeting of those students on campuses here in the US.
That highlights the need for CI awareness and reporting education and engagement by CI professionals across the enterprise to talk with personnel within industry and academic institutions to inform them on the breadth and scope of the threat, identify potential vulnerabilities, and provide them with a mechanism to report early and often. Additionally, educate them on the potential impact the FIE threat will have on their profit margins. The FBI has done a great job promoting awareness and getting the message out on their website, in videos, on social media, and during various lectures and speaking engagements. An area I think we need to do better on is with CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., reviews and processes. Foreign companies seeking to exploit loopholes or export sensitive dual use or military grade technologies pose a significant concern. The current process is overly bureaucratic and requires an overhaul to reduce the multiple layers and stovepipes that exist with the current system, which makes it very easy to exploit. A prime example of this was in Jacksonville, Florida, earlier this year, where a U.S. naval officer, his wife, and 2 Chinese nationals were charged with export control violations for trying to illegally ship U.S. military watercraft engines to China. Can you talk about the CFIUS program and how we can get left of theft and how we can better structure that program to prevent the foreign adversary from being able to exploit it?
You raise an excellent point. And each of these is our tactical tools, right? So we've got CFIUS, we have export controls, we have the very narrow economic espionage statute, but they're tactical, right? And so I think, in order to really address this challenge, we really need to think of things strategically. And that's difficult because there's a lot of stakeholders, right? And there's a lot of, we want to collaborate with China. Our businesses want to do business in China. But you also see what I would call the elite capture of, how many businesses and celebrities have apologized to the Chinese government. And I think that's one of the challenges of moving from this tactical to the strategic. And I think that's what it's going to really take, is taking a step back and saying, okay, how do we, what do we really need to protect? How do we do this in a holistic way? And not break the system more than we rise to the challenge.
You mentioned the strategy piece, which is a big gap. Strategic intelligence in the U.S. has atrophied after the 2 decades of counterterrorism operations. The IC should have seen China's rise on the global stage and their infiltration. Everything our government, technology, industry, commerce, telecommunications, our infrastructure, our society, they've gotten into everything. The Chinese government has exploited America and its allies' focus on counterterrorism, growing its military and making economic investments around the globe to garner influence and power. China is not the only one. Russia's invasion of Georgia and now the war in Ukraine, in addition to Iran's attempts to disrupt relations with Israel and exert control in the region after the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan and reduced force presence in the Levant, are prime examples of how the U.S. has been oblivious to the strategic threats looming on the horizon because we were over-inundated with current and tactical intelligence, reacting to the threat rather than strategically posturing to confront these challenges when conditions favor the U.S. and our allies and partners. Similarly, we need to look at our commercial partners that are developing technologies for the Department of Defense. We've turned a blind eye for way too long and not held these companies, driven by their profit margins, to do what's best for the nation. Instead, we go with the lowest bidder, which causes things to get cut or underfunded, like network security, which has been an issue over the past 5 years. Recent news reports on cleared defense contract companies being hacked and sensitive data being stolen by the PRC, DPRK, Russia, and other cyber criminals is becoming a common thing. Additionally, many of these companies want to export their technologies abroad. While we support capitalism and free markets, we must ask ourselves, at what cost? When companies are doing business with Chinese-based companies or their subsidiaries, The risks to U.S. technological advantage and security are threatened. Should we tell these companies, if you're going to do business or share information with China or other adversarial states, then you are no longer allowed to receive DOD R&D contracts? If we do that, well, then we run the risk of ostracizing our own industrial base and U.S. companies. Where's the happy medium? Is there one?
There's a lot of questions baked in there. So first yeah, I mean, that's the advantages and disadvantages of democracy. We were easily distracted, and rightfully so, given the events of 9/11. But that did come with the cost of thinking strategically or making those strategic investments. Although people will push back on that, because we do have a lot of innovations and a lot of investments across a wide range of technologies, and some really amazing work going on the national labs, the defense labs, universities. And the whole question of the challenge of doing business. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about those market access issues, to raise those, to not look the other way, not force individual companies to be the solely complaining about what's going on. Having sat in rooms with them, many people will say, well, their fiduciary obligation is to their shareholders, and so they're kind of stuck. They're stuck, even when whatever the right thing is. But I think it again comes down to the whole idea of how do we create these public-private partnerships? How do we think strategically about the way we develop things? And how do we put some teeth on things? Build in cybersecurity requirements into the contracts. Build in those kinds of things, because companies are not going to do that unless it's actually in that contract. Don't assume that the nice to haves, or what, the deliver uncompromised, that issue. I mean, that just needs to be written into the contract. So I think if you ask the American public if that was a no-brainer, I think that they would agree.
That last piece about CI and the contracts is critical. If we don't get that language written into the contracts that is enforceable and tells industry partners that if they don't safeguard and provide an uncompromised product, then they're not going to end up getting anything. That return on investment is nil, because they haven't delivered what they promised. That sends a clear message to protect your information, personnel, networks, systems, and technologies. Until you affect the company's profit margins, they will continue to do what's in their pocketbook or paycheck's best interest. They're not going to take it seriously otherwise. For example, if a company has a multi-billion-dollar contract that they lose or fail to secure a re-up option because they delivered a technology that is compromised, sends a clear message this behavior and the lack of security will not be tolerated and may result in the contract being terminated. It shows that the USG and DOD are serious about protecting our future technological advantages, and failure to do so will result in negative consequences for those companies and universities responsible for enabling or allowing this to occur. It's not just the company's investment. It's incumbent upon DOD and the USG to be good stewards of taxpayer funds and ensure all parties are protecting these investments and future technologies and capabilities from exploitation by the foreign intelligence entities. That brings us to the next question. How can the CI enterprise detect, exploit, and/or neutralize FIE's attempts to target, collect, and exploit U.S. defense technologies and research, development, and acquisition activities and investments?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think it really hits at what kind of information do we need, right? How do we understand? And it, I tell folks, I'm not really a CI person. I started out, I'm a scientist. I worked in labs, I lived and worked in China. But I realized really quickly that if I wanted to understand China's S&T development, I had to understand how they targeted our technologies. And so there's no quick fix. There's no easy button. I wish there was. But it really will entail you need people with technical expertise, you need folks that are familiar with the S&T system in China, and we we need to look at where's research happening, who's doing what where, to really understand, get in front of things. Of course, that's going to be harder as China has restricted its academic publications in the Chinese language, which is not what I would say great science powers do, but hide their research. But unfortunately, that the Chinese government has decided to do that. But I think that's one side of it. And then the other side is to really understand that the early part of the development cycle is what is being targeted. We don't get a free pass on that anymore. And to think through, build security in from the beginning in these programs. And we want the best and brightest minds to be working on this. Of course, the challenge with that is, and we've seen with several cases, that because of these talent programs, we're not always getting the best and brightest. We're getting who the Chinese government is sending us. And so, we need to find ways, creative ways to, not break our system, but to, take a hard look at what do we get out of these collaborations, whether, especially at the government level, government lab to government lab, or, and, this isn't going to make, this never makes me very popular saying this, but, our flagship academic institutions, our land-grant universities, their budgets have been cut over and over and over again. So, there's no free lunch. We have to think about if, we want these universities that do some of the most amazing work in the world, but, they're a state university in name only, with receiving, a fraction of their budget from the states. And so, that's in some ways created a lot of this problem.
I agree. When academic institutions receive grants from the Chinese government, it makes these universities an extension of the PRC's negative influence within our country and our research and development community. This creates a huge problem for the DOD's RDA efforts. Instead of academic institutions funded by the U.S. government and willing to contribute to the U.S.'s national security, we're faced with institutions willing to sell themselves for profit instead of being a positive contribution to U.S. competition against revisionist powers. I know we've mainly talked about U.S. interests. However, this is not a U.S. only problem. When we look at our allies and partners, we see that they are being targeted and exploited by the PRC as well. In Europe, we discussed the biotech data being collected by the PRC, unbeknownst to the European populace. The majority of these were done via genetic testing sites. Knowing our adversaries are targeting and exploiting our allies and partners, how do we come together at the strategic level to impose costs and deter or degrade these activities? For example, public shaming campaigns to highlight to the world what the PRC is doing, while simultaneously messaging them to cease their predatory and illegal practices. Leveraging sanctions to impose costs on the PRC for violating the global norms and removing protections and provisions that China currently benefits from, like its developing nation status that gives it an advantage over its competitors. So who else should be concerned about the exploitation and theft of U.S. allied and partner nation defense technologies and their companies' proprietary information?
Yeah, so a lot of questions baked in there. So I think the first one is, we see very similar tactics, strategies, organizations, programs that target our European allies as well as our East Asian allies, such as Japan and Korea. A book that came out is called China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage. In that we lay out some of these case studies, and some of the activities that are going on in these different countries. And it really it's going to take full court, they have a full court effort against us, and it's really, working with our friends, allies, like-minded, to counter, this kind of behavior, because it really breaks the system. And so, and also, especially with our military allies and, NATO, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And so, how do we, work together to protect all of our industrial bases as well as our competitive advantage? And so it really is going to take a concerted effort. And also, that's where it's really important to talk about, okay, whose values do you want these technologies, especially these new ones, such as AI and biotech, to reflect? Do you want them to reflect the core, values of open democratic nations, or an authoritarian state? And I think that's really what's at stake.
Couldn't agree with you more. The monopoly that the PRC has on some of these technologies like AI, quantum computing, and technologies in the bioindustry are extremely concerning. Which brings me to the next question. How is the PRC leveraging emerging and disruptive technologies to commit or aid in its state-sponsored espionage activities? We previously discussed some of these technologies and how the PRC is leveraging the convergence of a range of technologies that span multiple industries, finance, travel, health, and security, to create these smart cities to surveil and control their populations. Now, they're exporting these same practices and technologies around the globe, leveraging various global institutions such as the World Health Organization, the G7 Summit, and other forums to promote and advocate the adoption of these invasive authoritarian practices to restrict who can travel and have access to financial institutions. What are your perspectives and thoughts on how the PRC are using these technologies and practices to commit espionage and conduct other activities to bring about their global hegemony?
So I can only speculate on, what they're doing from their espionage standpoint. But what's concerning to me, looking at the different pieces that China is putting in place, that include, the cameras, it includes port technology, includes technology at different airports. There's an incredible amount of conversation about Huawei and telecommunications. And we just only have to look at, what China is doing in its own country, restricting the internet, restricting, personal freedoms, the ability to travel, or, having the surveillance. There's been articles in the news and the press about, the collection of DNA from men and boys, especially in their ethnic minorities, especially out in Xinjiang. And that's really scary stuff. I mean, that is very not in line, with the values of open democratic countries. And, those are things that we can't give them a pass on. And so, one can only extrapolate, if you have access to these kinds of technologies and you're willing to use them against your own citizens, that you're probably willing to use them against others.
The scary piece is how their global surveillance state works. I was watching a video on how PRC can identify a person by their gait, the way they walk, or their facial features and biometrics, to future capabilities using AI in the biotech industry. I could see them easily targeting certain DNA strains and genomes. All these capabilities would be leveraged to ensure Chinese citizens and potentially everyone around the globe from being able to travel, communicate, access food, money, housing, employment, unless you toe that party line. They could easily ostracize a population over in Africa, where they've created these compounds and facilities separated from the host nation, but they still want to be able to impose costs and controls on the host nation population to ensure PRC objectives and interests are achieved. This creates resentment and opportunities for conflict to quickly erupt. As we see the PRC continue to expand its reach across the globe, what are some things Western countries can use to counter the PRC's technological advancements and information dominance and influence in these areas?
Wow, that's a big question. So, well, the first things, the things that you mentioned about restricting people to be able to get loans or where they live or jobs, those are already part of the social credit system. And so those are things we're already seeing starting to be deployed, as well as for Western companies with their social credit system as well. And as far as exporting these both technologies and this mindset, it's one of those things where we kind of have to get in the game too, as far as we will hear a question, and I think telecommunications is a great example of, well, I have either Huawei internet or I have no internet. And so those development kinds of projects, to some leadership are attractive because there are no environmental or very limited environmental regulations placed on them, or human rights concerns, or and also there are stories of the lower cost or no cost in order to get their technologies into some of these places. And so they really reflect the strategy of the Chinese government, as opposed to, again, going back to those market-based decisions. And so it really is going to require a concerted effort of the U.S. allies, like-minded, to work on these development areas and be an alternative, because in a lot of these places there's no alternative. And so it's really hard to say no to nothing, to have nothing or Chinese tech, and that's just the reality. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh no, don't put that in there, but that we don't have a viable alternative. And there will be places, because their value, or they are more authoritarian in nature, that they want that kind of a system in their country. And that's also something that needs to be discussed, because it really comes down to, again, which value system do you want?
It's very evident in the Southcom theater, where you see the PRC come in, help at a very low cost fee to update a country's infrastructure, telecommunication system, airport security, and many other examples. One project after another, the U.S. couldn't keep pace. Now, you look at the breadth and scope of the PRC's investments globally and the uninhibited access they will have with increased computing and processing power is extremely concerning. Which brings us to the second to last question. How does the PRC and the FIE threat impact U.S. Special Operations Forces, RDA activities and investments, and the enterprise overall? SOF's global presence and activities are threatened by the PRC. How do you see the threat to SOF from the PRC globally?
Well, I think freedom, you mentioned like freedom of movement. That is a big one. The ability to cross borders, especially with whether it be biometrics, port control, all those kinds of things. And I think we have to think the unthinkable in some ways, because just because we wouldn't do something doesn't mean that they wouldn't, or another actor wouldn't. And so really kind of taking it back to its earlier in the development of what we do, how we do it, both from a technology standpoint, but also from it gets harder, your identity or how you move, especially, we all walk around with our phones and collect, which I love my phone, don't get me wrong, but thinking through the implications of, what does it mean to have all this data? And who has access to that kind of data? What can they learn from you from that kind of data? And even if it's not you, your family members, what can they learn? And who has access to that data? And I think in some ways that's, we talk about, okay, the telecommunications, port technology, surveillance cameras all over, and then you layer on top of that your biometrics and your genomic data. We laugh. It's not funny, but it's like, is it Brave New World or is it 1984? Is it Minority Report or 1984? And and we laugh, and some of it, it's really, again, not about what we can do with the data today, although there are a lot of things you can do with the data today. It's what are you going to be able to do with that 5-10 years down the road, and being able or willing, because of lack of privacy concerns, to put together all of that data to reach your strategic goals. And there's a lot of the academic community debates, my own center debates about, is data the new oil? Is it not? How much do you need? Where is machine learning? Is it just garbage in, garbage out? But I think it's, again, focusing on what is the strategic goal, especially if it's just different than ours. And so, especially with the kinds of work that and missions that our SOF forces have, I could see a lot of implications, especially related to data and that freedom of movement.
Yes, freedom of movement is extremely restricted, which is causing a paradigm shift in how we approach problem sets in the future. Fox News did a great job on their episode titled Surveillance Capitalism. In the show, they used two newly purchased identical cell phones, one in airplane mode and the other one that wasn't. It was in normal operating mode. The one in airplane mode had significantly more data gathered on it than the one operating normally. It was astonishing. You think these little tricks of the trade will limit your visibility, when in all actuality, they highlight you and put you further at risk. Then you look at the amount of data being collected on you without your knowledge and who has access to that data. It's very concerning. Digital breadcrumbs are being collected on people constantly. A person traveling can now be linked in time and space anywhere on the globe through travel data, vehicle telematics, financial records, transactions, telecommunications, and online applications and communications and presence. It's astonishing, to say the least.
Just think your hotel, your airline, because you want those points.
Yep.
All the implications of that, whether it be hotel, airline, rental car, you name it. And I think you hit a really important point of what is privacy and who owns that. I think here in the US, we are very concerned with government owning that information, yet we'll fill out a survey and give companies all kinds of information for that $5 Starbucks card, and not thinking about that, whether it be, social media or music videos or what have you. But then the whole idea that other governments don't have those same restrictions and have demonstrated a willingness to use that kind of data in ways that are different than the way our values would allow us to use that kind of data.
You look at the US government's use of data compared to the PRC's use, and the weaponization they've taken it to is frightening. Separately, you look at the corporations and how they're using that same data to increase their profits, raises some concerns as well. Definitely the threat of data aggregation is a cause for concern, but so is the willingness of consumers to flippantly provide this data freely poses huge risks to the individual and national security. This disregard for security and privacy puts citizens at risk of further encroachment and reductions in freedoms, a threat to our way of life if the Communist Party is able to succeed in their aspirations to have global control. We see their surveillance systems currently being sold and exported around the globe. In addition, the restrictions and influence over the media, academic institutions, and commercial businesses should be a wake-up call to the existential threat we are facing as the PRC continues to gain influence in America and other like-minded nations. We are still in a position to push back, though. We can use our legislators to restrict the sale of American land to the PRC, reduce dependence on Chinese goods and services, and remove tax protections that give the PRC a competitive advantage. These are some simple ways to impose costs while bolstering our own economy and tech industry, to innovate and develop American products grown here within our own homeland. Will these actions push us towards conflict? Our leaders will have to weigh those risks and determine the best way forward as we compete with China and other revisionist states. I think there's ways to push back without sliding closer to conflict.
Yeah, I think we touched on that a little bit. Security has to be baked in from the beginning. And we have to, go into these transactions and these programs, eyes wide open in the idea of it has to be in the contract. And that's pretty much, we laughed a little bit about deliver on compromise, but it really just needs to be there, and I have to have these conversations up front. And also, do that risk calculation of, okay, where can we accept risk? Where can we not? What things are really have to be protected? What things, you can let slide a little bit. But I think especially with, the new technologies and other kinds of capabilities that, we develop, especially for the SOF mission. I mean, there needs to be a lot more consideration going to that. And what that looks like. There's no free lunch, and exactly thinking about how do we, get the best minds working on these really hardest of the hard problems, but at the same time, ensure that, that security piece is baked in from the beginning.
I definitely agree there. As we come to the conclusion of our interview, I wanted to give you the opportunity for any closing comments. The floor is yours.
So just to pull a thread that you had just mentioned, that China really has controlled the narrative despite violating global norms of business and research. And as a result, I think a lot of our impacted groups don't really recognize that growing challenge that this rivalry poses, and often questions if there's actually a problem. We see that a lot, especially in academia, despite the growing influence, that China's doubling down on these practices. And so we really need to tell those stories, because those are going to be really important. And not to sound overly dramatic, but this is actually, it's a question of values. It's, what view of the world do you really want? And that China's strategy to target our technology, it's coordinated, it's massive, it's comprehensive. And I would argue it's been very, very effective. And while, China's goal is technological self-sufficiency, it's not taking a path of free and fair market competition to get there. And it uses a variety of methods to achieve basically a playing field tilted in its own favor. And it leverages its relationships to get there. And we have to, we can't protect our way out of this. As I mentioned earlier, we have to improve ourselves. We have to invest in our future. And that's not only at the PhD level, it's our universities, it's our K through 12 STEM education. Kind of stop that leaky STEM pipeline. And we have to be honest. We have to face the facts. Beijing doesn't play by free market rules, and we need to call them out on that. There's been no cost to them really for doing that, and we got to tell those stories. We have to increase transparency and ask for those kinds of things. We need to ensure true reciprocity, and if we make an agreement, there has to be repercussions for not living up to those agreements. If you agree to share data, and we're the only one sharing data, that's a challenge. But I think one of the biggest challenges is that the reality that China is presenting in the short term is inconvenient for those that actually benefit from it. And that's companies looking for long-term profits, or short-term profits, not long-term sustainability, of academics that benefit personally from the kinds of investments that are happening. And China is really masterful at this divide and conquer. So we have to see it for what it is. And tell the stories, because it really, again, it comes down to which view of the world do you want.
Again, Anna, I appreciate your candidness and time. Thank you for conducting this ThinkJSOU event. On behalf of the Joint Special Operations University and CI professionals throughout the government, thank you for discussing these pertinent questions and topics today.